How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Beis, Daf 112 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, today is a very exciting day here at Babble on Talmud. It is an exciting day because we finish the second to last chapter of Masechta Zevachim and we begin the final chapter of Masechta Zevachim. This is like the final climb to the summit. Unbelievable. Chevra, can you imagine? We learned, we're not done yet, but we're at the final summit, or whatever, what's it called? Like when you do the final push to get to the top. We're at the final push of Masechta Zevachim. I don't know, I think more so than any other Masechta, this has been something else. Can you imagine? We did it, friends. We're just regular people that said we're going to do it, and we did it. Masechta Zevachim. That's hard stuff. Zevachim has been hard stuff. We're mamish, we're summiting the mountain. Friends, as I mentioned yesterday, we have some work to do on Daf Yud Aleph from a base. Turns out that actually it wasn't actually that hard, which is great. So hopefully we should be okay there. Okay, 4 sections of today's daf. Offering bird offerings, bachutz. I didn't really know how to describe it. This relates to the Mishnah that we learned yesterday about offering bird offerings, bachutz. And we're really, the bulk of the focus is going to be on the shita of Reb Shimon that we saw in the Mishnah yesterday. That was a little bit tricky to understand. So we're going to work through that, but it shouldn't be too difficult. And then we get to a new Mishnah, the last Mishnah of chapter 13, blood of a korbin chatas, bachutz. Okay, we'll get there. So the dam of a korbin chatas, bachutz. And then we begin the final chapter of Masechta Zevachim. Now, there's basically one massive Mishnah at the beginning of the last chapter of Masechta Zevachim. I have to imagine that's probably, no, actually I know for a fact, that basically it's one of those where all the Mishnayos are just lumped together at the beginning of the parak. So basically once we get to chapter 14 of Masechta Zevachim today, we are just going to be learning through the Mishnayos essentially of the 14th chapter. Now, so what does that talk about? So all sorts of things that you're patur for bachutz. So interestingly, we thought that when we got to the end of chapter 13, we'd be done with hashoichet v'amayla bachutz. Not quite yet. While up until now we've been talking about all the things that you're chayiv for bachutz, the Mishnayos that we're going to learn today in the final chapter of Masechta Zevachim will discuss things that you are patur for if you do them by chutz. We'll have a whole bunch of those, and then at the end we get to, in my opinion, a very interesting history lesson of Bamahs. When were they allowed? When were they not allowed? And details surrounding Bamahs and the different places that we've set up mishkans throughout our history. So in my opinion, that's an interesting discussion right there in the Mishnayos in the final chapter of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, let's jump in over here to Daf Yud Beis of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, we begin on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis, on the first of the wide lines of Yud Aleph Amid Beis. So we're really be'etzem learning Yud Aleph Amid Beis as well today. Okay. Anyways, I was planning to start at the Mishnah, a little bit later on. Anyways, fine. So the Gemara, normally I wouldn't just, usually I would avoid just like learning a Mishnah at the end of a daf and then leaving you hanging. But I had to get something done yesterday. But anyways, so this Gemara really focuses on the end of the Mishnah that we learned yesterday. Just a little, should I even read the Mishnah again? You know what? Maybe I'll just read the Mishnah again. I can go a little bit quicker than I did yesterday, but just as a refresher for what it's talking about. So it's talking about offering birds bachutz. And I'm going to read the Mishnah actually on Daf Yud Aleph Mud Aleph. Hopefully I can move through it efficiently. Hamolek es ha'of bifnim vela bachutz chayiv, molek bachutz vela bachutz patur. So milika, right? When it comes to a bird, so in the Azara, when you offer a bird korbin, so of course you don't do shchita, you do malika. So if you do malika on a bird in the Azara, take it out of the Azara and offer it on, outside of the Azara, so you'll be chayiv for that. However, if you do malika outside of the Azara, you're outside the Azara, the bird's alive, you do malika outside of the Azara, and you offer it, you will be patur for that. Hashaychet es ha'oif bifnim vela bachutz patur. Shachat bachutz vela bachutz chayiv. Now, somebody who shechts a bird in the Azara. Now, in the Azara, you're supposed to do malika, but this person did shchita in the Azara and then took the bird outside and offered it patur. However, a person who does shchita on a bird outside of the Azara and then offers it on offers it on this altar outside of the Azara, they will be chayav for that. Now, here we now get up to the part of the Mishnah that our Gemara is going to focus on. But there's basically two parts of the Gemara. Part one is literally one line, and that is going to that'll be on what we're about to read together. And then we get to the opinion of Reb Shimon. Basically, all the rest of the Gemara until the next Mishnah is going to be on Reb Shimon's opinion. So here's the first part, which is not yet Reb Shimon's opinion. So nimtza derech hechshero bifnim p'turo bachutz. So the Mishnah says that derech hechshero bifnim, right, the way that you are meant to offer a bird offering in the Azara is by malika. So derech hechshero bifnim, when you slaughter this malika, this bird properly in the Azara, and then you take it out of the Azara, you're chayiv for burning it on this altar. Yet if you do malika outside of the Azara, you're going to be patur. I hope I just said things right. If you do malika in the Azara and take it out and burn it outside the Azara, you're chayiv. But if you do the malika outside of the Azara, you're going to be patur. So we say derech hechsher bifnim, the way that you do things properly inside the Azara, paturo bachutz, you would be patur for doing that thing outside of the Azara. Derech hechsher mibachutz, and the way to be machsher mibachutz. Now, what the Gemara is about to ask is, what do you mean derech hechsher mibachutz? If you have an animal that's hektish and it needs to be offered in the Azara, slaughtering it outside of the Azara doesn't make it kosher. You're going to be chayiv for that. So patur mibifnim, and if you slaughter this bird in the Azara and take it out, you're going to be patur. But basically, the Gemara is going to ask, why don't we actually jump into the Gemara right now, because it's literally one line. Oh, so it's actually the last of the thin lines of the Gemara. Right, so it says, Hayachsheru chiyuvahu. What do you mean that by slaughtering it outside the Azara, it's kosher? It's not kosher. You're chayiv for slaughtering it outside, a bird outside of the Azara and offering it outside of the Azara. So tani chiyuvo, say, you know what, you're right. Don't say hechsheru, instead say chiyuvo. So basically what it should say is, derech chiyuvo mibachutz, that in the way that you will be chayiv for offering this bird bachutz, i.e. via shchita, p'tur mibifnim, if you do shchita in the Azara and then take the bird out, you will be patur for that. And now, I'm back in the Mishnah now. We are going to look at the opinion of Reb Shimon, and basically the entire Gemara at this point is going to be focused on understanding the opinion of Reb Shimon. It says Reb Shimon Amar Kol Shechayavin Olav Bachutz. So any scenario where you'd be chayav bachutz, chayavin al kayotze bo bifnim shehele bachutz. So any scenario where you would be chayav bachutz, you would also be chayav if you did that same thing in the Azara and then took it out of the Azara to burn on the Mizbeach and on what the altar you set up. And the Gemara is going to explain what's he talking about. Chutz min hashoichet bifnim ma'ale bachutz. The exception being somebody who slaughters in the Azara, takes it out of the Azara and offers it on his altar outside of the Azara. Meaning, because based on Reb Shimon's principle, you would think that since you're chayav for slaughtering the bird outside of the Azara and offering it outside of the Azara, so based on that principle, you would also be chayav for slaughtering it in the Azara and bringing it outside of the Azara and offering it outside of the Azara. And yet, you are patur for slaughtering the bird in the Azara and then taking it outside of the Azara and burning it outside of the Azara. So we have to understand what is the context for Reb Shimon's statement. Says the Gemara on the first of the wide lines, Reb Shimon Omer v'chulei, Ahecha koi, what is Reb Shimon referring to? Ilema reisha koi, if he's talking about the reisha. What did the Mishnah say in the reisha? Hamolek of bifnim. Somebody does malika on a bird in the azara, v'hela b'chutz, and then takes it outside of the azara and is maila it outside of the azara. Chayav malak bachutz, v'hela b'chutz patur, and yet if you do malika outside of the azara and are mailet outside of the azara, you are going to be patur. V'amar Reb Shimon, and Reb Shimon is going to say, ma pitom, you're not going to be patur for malika outside of the azara. Rather, ki heichi de bifnim mechayev, that you rather just like in the azara. If you did malika in the azara and took it outside of the azara and offered it, you'd be chayiv. So also if you do malika outside of the azara, you'd be chayiv as well. Right, so bachutz namin b'chayiv, you also chayiv do malika outside of the zara. But if that's the case, hai kol shechayav and all of bachutz, kol shechayav and all of bifnim mi ba'ilei. Reb Shimon's principle was that anything that you're chayiv for outside of the zara, you're also chayiv for if you do it inside the zara and then bring it outside the zara. That's what Reb Shimon said. Now, what we just suggested is that since malika is chayiv in the azara when you take it outside of the zara, you should also be chayiv for doing it outside of the zara. So that's inside out. Reb Shimon's statement starts from anything that you're chayiv outside of the zara, you're also chayiv in the zara. What we wanted to argue just now is that since you're chayiv for malika in the zara, you should also be chayiv for it outside of the zara. That is backwards. Ella kiechi de bachutz lo michayiv. Where am I? Okay, fine. Ella kiechi de bachutz lo michayiv. Okay, so let's say it the other way around. That just like malika bachutz, you are not chayiv, bifnim nami lo lichayiv. Okay, so if you want to suggest, okay, so what Reb Shimon is saying then is that when it comes to malika bachutz, just like you are not chayiv for malika bachutz, if you do malika on a bird bachutz and then you offer bachutz, you are not chayiv. So say just like you're not chayiv bachutz, so bifnim nami lo michayiv, you're also not chayiv if you do malika in the azara and bring it outside. But hai kol she'ein chayiv and olav bachutz mi ba'ilei. The thing is that Reb Shimon's principle was that whatever you are chayiv for bachutz, you are also chayiv for bifnim, and then you take it out bachutz. Yet over here, what we just suggested is that Reb Shimon is saying that since you're not chayiv for malika bachutz, you should not be chayiv for it bifnim. But that's the opposite of what his principle was. Ella aseifa kai. Okay, rather it's talking about the seifa. Ashoichet of bifnim, that somebody who slaughters a bird bifnim, vehela bachutz, and then offers it bachutz, patur. Shachat bachutz, vehela bachutz chayiv. And yet, if he slaughters the bird outside the azara and offers it outside of the azara, he is chayiv. V'amar Reb Shimon, and Reb Shimon is saying, no, he's not chayiv outside of the azara for slaughtering. Just like somebody who slaughters a bird in the azara is patur if he brings it out of the azara and offers it there. So bachutz nami lo mechayiv. So also if he slaughters the bird bachutz and offers it bachutz, he's also not chayiv. But I call she'ein chayavin mi bai le. But then we should be saying his principle should not be about kol shechayavin, rather kol she'ein chayavin. Okay, so ela kiechi de bachutz michayiv b'fnim nami michayiv. Okay, well, sorry that it's so confusing, but I hope you're holding on. Rather, what Reb Shimon is saying is that just like when it comes to birds that are slaughtered outside of the azara, you are going to be chayiv for offering them outside of the azara, and therefore, so therefore also, if you slaughter a bird in the azar and then take it out of the azar, you're going to be chayiv as well. The thing is, hakatani chutz min hashoichet b'fnim b'ma'ala b'chutz. But Reb Shimon had said that that's the exception, right? Meaning, what Reb Shimon said in the Mishnah is that any scenario where you'd be chayiv b'chutz, you'd also be chayiv b'fnim. So therefore, it would, okay, I have a great example. The Gemara just suggested, well, since you're chayiv for slaughtering a bird bachutz and offering a bachutz, so you should also be chayiv for slaughtering a bifnim and offering a bachutz. The thing is, Rabbi Shimon explicitly has said to the exclusion of shchita. So what is Rabbi Shimon talking about then? So Amar Zeiri says Zeiri shchitas behema balayla ika benayu, that the nafkamina is slaughtering an animal at night. that if you slaughter an animal at night and offer it bachutz, this is what is going on. The Mishnah, you have to add to the Mishnah, and similarly, behema bifnim balayla. If a person, if a kohen, let's say, slaughters an animal in the azara at night, you're not supposed to slaughter at night, but this kohen slaughtered at night, and then took it outside of the azara and offered it there, patur. So we're saying in that case, patur, because you don't slaughter korbanos at night. The assumption being also that if you put it on the mizbeach, you would have to take it down, like Rav Yehuda says. Shachad bachutz balayla vela bachutz chayv, and yet if you slaughter the korbin outside of the azara at night and offer it at night, you'd be chayav. Reb Shimon Omer kol shechayav and all of bachutz chayav al kayotzu b'bifnim. To which Reb Shimon says, well, actually, since you'd be chayav for slaughtering an animal at night outside of the azara and offering it outside of the azara, you'd also be chayav even if you slaughter it in the azara at night and then take it out and offer it. Where am I? Where am I? So Reb Shimon, I'm reading Reb Shimon again. So Reb Shimon Omer shekol shechayav all of bachutz chayav al kayotzu b'bifnim ve'ela bachutz. Okay, that anything you be chayav for outside, you also be chayav for inside, and then taking it outside. So therefore, if we're saying that you're chayav for slaughtering an animal at night outside of the zar and offering it outside of the zar, so also slaughtering it at night inside the zar you'd be chayav for. Chutz min hashoichet oif bifnim vela b'chutz, the exception being slaughtering a bird bifnim inside the azara and then taking it outside of the azara. Ravi Omar says, Ravi, Kabbalah b'chli chol ike benayu, that Reb Shimon is commenting on receiving the blood of an animal in a non-klisharis, non-holy vessel, on a regular vessel. And similarly, says the Tanakama, Mekabel b'chli chol bifnim, somebody who receives the blood with a non-holy vessel in the azar, v'hela b'chutz patur, and then takes it outside and offers it there, patur. Hamakabel b'chli chol b'chutz v'hela b'chutz chayav. And yet, if the kohen receives the blood in a non-klisharis outside of azar and offers it outside azar, is chayav. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, he says, mapitom, that in the azar it would be patur, rather kol shechayav and olav bachutz chayav and olav kayotze bo b'fnim ve'lo bachutz. Rather, says Reb Shimon, that anything you're chayav for outside of the azar, and we're saying in this case, Kabbalas Hadam in a klichol, you'd also be chayiv if you do it in the azar. The only exception being chutz min hashechet of bifnim vela b'chutz, except for if you slaughter a bird in the azar and then take it out of the azar, you would be patur for that. However, for receiving the blood in a klichol, you would be chayiv for that, for taking it out. Says Reb Shimon, v'hashta detani avur deshmuel. But however, now that avur deshmuel has taught hamolek of bifnim, that somebody who does malika on a bird inside the azar, vehelo bachutz, and then offered it outside of the azar, chayav, malak bachutz, vele bachutz patur. Yet if the malika is done outside of the azar, and the bird is offered outside of the azar, then he's going to be patur. Reb Shimon mechayev. Reb Shimon says you would be chayev. So again, you have malika being done in the azar, the bird is taken outside of the azar and offered outside of the azar. So we're saying that you're chayiv for that. And Tanakama says that, however, if the malika was outside of the azar, you'd be patur for offering it outside of the azar. Reb Shimon disagrees and says that just like you are chayiv for when the malika was done in the azar, you're also chayiv when the malika was done outside of the azar. Skip the next three words. And therefore, Tani, rather change the Mishnah. Don't say that the Mishnah is talking about anything that you're chayiv for outside of the azar, you also chayiv for in the azar. Rather, flip it around. Kol shechayav and olav bifnim, anything that you're chayiv for in the azar, v'hela b'chutz, and you offer it outside, just like malika, for example, is chayav and olav b'chutz. Also, if you do malika outside of the azar and offer it outside of the azar, you'd be chayiv there as well. Sheesh, wow. Chayav, if you managed to, my apologies, that was just that's a hard Gemara to kind of do at the pace that we do. So So shkoyach if you hung on, and if you didn't, we're going to go weiter. But basically, we're just trying to figure out the scenario in which case where Rabbi Shimon is saying that when you chayiv outside, you also chayiv inside, and then take it outside. We ended up saying that you have to actually flip it around, and the principle is that actually whenever you chayiv inside, you're also going to be chayiv if you do it outside. Okay. Fine. And now we get up to the final Mishnah of the 13th chapter of Masechta Zevachim. Chatas shekibel dama bikos echod. So if you have a korbin chatas, I assume she's talking about regular korbin chatas. Let me actually just double check, because I did have a question on that, but I imagine that we are talking about a regular korbin chatas. Let me just double check here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think he's just talking about regular korbin chatas. Now, you have a korbin chatas, shekibel dama bikos echod. Okay, so you slaughtered a korbin chatas, and kabbalas adam was kabbalas adamd in one vessel. Okay. Nasan bachutz, so what's interesting about the scenario is that you have the kohen who's doing the avoda, but it's for a random person, right? Ruvain had to bring a korbin chatas for some reason. Shimon the kohen is taking care of all the stuff that needs to be done in the azar. So it's Ruvain's korbin chatas. So at the end of the day, we have to know, is Ruvain Yotzef? Did he get his kapara for bringing korbin chatas? Now Shimon's, Ruvain's kapara is in Shimon's hands. So now Shimon the kohen, so chatas shekibel dama b'kos echad. So the kohanim received the kabbalas adam in a vessel. Nosan bachutz, and then the kohen went outside and applied the blood to the altar that they set up outside the azar. Because of nosan b'fnim, and then he came back into the azara and applied the blood in the azara b'fnim. If Shimon the kohen applied the blood in the azara because of nosan bachutz, and then went and took the remainders of the blood and went outside and applied the blood on the altar outside chayav, in either case, whether he first applied the blood outside or first applied the blood inside, either way, Shimon the kohen is going to be chayav for Hazarik bachutz. Shekula roi b'fnim, because all of that blood, since it was all in one vessel, all of that blood was fit to be applied inside the azara. Kibel dama b'shtei koses. Now what happens though if the blood was received in two separate vessels? Nosan shneim b'fnim, if both vessels were applied in the azara, so patur. So patur, there's nothing to be chayiv for it. It was done in the azar. Shneim bachutz chayiv, if all of the blood, both vessels of blood were applied outside of the azar, he's going to be chayiv. Echad b'fnim ve'echad bachutz. Now, if the first vessel was applied in the azara, and then the second vessel was taken outside of the azara and offered there patur, the Gemara is going to explain why. Echad bachutz ve'echad b'fnim. What? And now, if the first vessel was applied outside of the azara, and then the second vessel was applied in the azara, chayiv ala chitzon. So Shimon the kohen is going to be chayiv for having applied the blood from the first vessel outside of the azar. But va'pnimi mechaper. But Ruvain gets his kapara from the fact that the second vessel was then taken inside of the azara and applied to the mizbeach for Ruvain. So Shimon the kohen will be chayiv for azarik bachutz, but Ruvain will get his kapara based on the fact that the blood from the second vessel was applied in the azara. Lima adavar dome, the Mishnah says, what is this similar to? Limafish chataso, to a scenario where a korban chatas has been designated. Okay, so Ruvain needs to bring a korbin chatas, and he says to Sarah the Sarah, you are going to be my korbin chatas. Ve'avda, and Sarah the wasn't ready to be a korbin chatas yet, and she flew the coop. Although I imagine we're talking about a sheep, and she just kind of, when nobody was looking, made her move. Ve'efish Acheres tachtel. So Reuven says, oh, don't know what happened to Sarah. Rivka, you're going to be a chatas instead. And Rivka's like, my lucky day. And then they found Sarah. And now there are these two korbanis, there's Sarah and Rivka, which are both eligible korbin chatases. Now, in order to explain this Mishnah, I have to kind of give away. I think the what makes most sense is to sprinkle a little bit of insight from the Gemara that we're going to learn in a few minutes, and that this Mishnah is the opinion of Rebbe, who says that what happens is, so of course there is the concept of chomesh chatos hamesos, of course, that come up from time to time. That there are 5 scenarios in which a korbin chatas, you just let it out, you basically let it starve to death. One of those scenarios is what's called chatas sheniskapru bailim ba'acher, a scenario where the owner of the korbin chatas already received atonement. So, for example, Reuven sets aside Sarah the U, to be his korbin chatas. Sarah gets lost, so he designates Rivka the U to be his korbin chatas, and takes Rivka the U to the base Hamikdash and offers Rivka the U as his korbin chatas, and he has now received atonement. He's done. He offered his korbin chatas. Then they find Sarah the U. So in that case, since Reuven already received his atonement through Rivka the U, Sarah the U is basically left to just starve to death. Now what happens in this case, though, that we're talking about, is they haven't yet offered Rivka the U, and they find Sarah the U. So now either one can be offered as a korbin. So what will happen is, whichever one is offered as the korbin chatas, the other one then becomes chatas sheniskapu ba'aleo, and we basically let it starve to death. Now that being the case, so shachat shtein bifnim patur. Okay, if both Sarah and Rivka were offered in the azara, so patur, Shimon the Kohen is not going to be chayiv for anything. Shtein bachutz chayiv. However, if both Sarah and Rivka were slaughtered outside of the azara, so then, assuming that Shimon the Kohen did all the slaughtering and everything, so Shimon the Kohen is going to be chayiv twice, because when he slaughtered, let's say he slaughtered Sarah first and then Rivka after. It doesn't have to be in that order, but let's say that's just what he did. We'll go in order. So when he slaughtered Sarah, he's going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz, because Sarah should have been slaughtered in the azara. And now that Sarah has been slaughtered outside of the azara, okay, he still has his opportunity to slaughter Rivka in the azara as a korban chatas, but he didn't do that. He slaughtered Rivka also outside of the azara. So since for each one of those animals there was an opportunity to slaughter them in the azara, yet he chose to slaughter them outside of the azara, he's going to be chayiv for each one of them separately. Achaz bifnim, v'achaz b'chutz patur. Now, if Sarah was slaughtered in the azara, which means that Reuven received his kapara. Shimon the Kohen slaughtered Sarah in the azara. Great, that's a kosher korban chatas. Great, Reuven receives his atonement. Now, what happens to Rivka the U? Chatas shemesu ba'aleh lemisa. I'm sorry, chatas sheniskapu ba'aleh ba'acher, and it's lemisa. So Rivka the U at this point is just let out to die. She's not a valid korban anymore. So therefore, if now she was slaughtered outside the azara, Shimon the Kohen, if he's the one who did it, would be patur for that, because at that point, Rivka the U was just going to be let out to die. Achaz bachutz v'achaz bifnim. If Sarah the U was slaughtered outside of the azara, when she should have been slaughtered inside the azara, so Shimon the Kohen will be chayiv for that. If he then takes Rivka the U into the azara and slaughters her properly in the azara, Reuven will receive his kapara from that. So chayiv ala chitzono, Shimon the Kohen will be chayiv for slaughtering Sarah the U outside of the azara. The apnimis mechaperes, but by slaughtering Rivka the U in the azara, Reuven will receive his kapara. Now, kashem shedama poter es bisar kachi poteres es bisar chaverto. A little note about me'ilah, right? A korbin chatas is kodshe kodshim. Once Reuven designated Sarah and Rivka to be korbanis, he can't get any benefit from them. Now, the halacha is, though, that post Zrika Sadam, there's a shas heter la'kohanim. The kohanim can now eat the meat of the korbin chatas after Zrika Sadam, and since the kohanim can eat the meat, there's no longer a din me'ilah. So what the Mishnah is now saying is that, let's read it inside. Kishem shedama poter es bisar. So let's say Shimon slaughters Sarah the U first, and then Rivka the U. So just like the Zrika Sadam for Sarah the U is going to permit the meat of Sarah the U to the Kohanim, and there will no longer be a din me'ilah by the meat of Sarah the U. So that Zrika Sadam permits the meat of Sarah the U, it also, from this point on, Rivka the U also will not have a din me'ilah, since at this point Rivka is a chatas sheniskapru by Leah Ba'acher, and there's no din me'ilah by chatas sheniskapru by Leah Ba'acher that stands to that stands to just be let to starve to death. So kachi poter says besar chaverta. So also the Zrika Sadam for Sarah the U means that Rivka the U, there's no longer a din me'ilah for her. Says the Gemara. In the Mishnah, we had said that when the blood of the korbin chatas was received all in one vessel, and the blood was applied in the azara, and then was applied outside of the azara, we had said that Shimon the Kohen is going to be chayiv for that. So bishlama bachutz v'chazav v'nosam b'fnim. So I understand why Shimon the Kohen would be chayiv. I understand why Shimon the Kohen would be chayiv. I understand why Shimon the Kohen would be chayiv when he applied the blood outside of the azar and then inside of the azar. Shekula roi lios bifnim, because all of the blood in the vessel was fit to be applied in the azar, and he didn't. The Shimon the Kohen didn't do that. He went outside of the azar, so he's going to be chayiv for that. But avol, however, bifnim ve'elan bachutz shirayim ninu. But if Shimon the Kohen already applied the blood in the azore, so then whatever is left over is just that. It's leftovers. It's shirayim. Why should it be chayiv for applying the shirayim bachutz? Hamani Reb Nechemya. This is the opinion of Reb Nechemya, the Amr who had said the other day, and Daf Kuf Yud. Is that where it was? Daf Kuf Yud? Yes, Daf Kuf Yud. The Amr Shiari Adam Shekriv Bachutz Chayev. They are Chayev for offering the Shiari Adam Bachutz. So therefore we have a stop. Basically the Mishnah is passing like Reb Nechemya, that if you have all the blood in one vessel and you applied the blood inside of the azar, and now you have the leftover blood and you apply that bachutz, we're saying you're chayiv, like Reb Nechemya says. Now, this is what I was saying before. Is this talking about regular chatas? My impression, right? When did we learn this? We learned this yesterday. This was yesterday's daf, right? I think I had said that my impression was that maybe Reb Nechemya agreed with maybe Reb Nechemya only had said that you're chayiv for the shirayim if it's a chatas apnimi. I wasn't so sure that he would say about a chatas achitzon, about a regular korbin chatas, but here we seem to be saying that Rabbi Nechemya, right? It seems like we're talking about a regular korbin chatas, and we're saying that it's the opinion of Rabbi Nechemya that you would be chayiv for the shirayim bachutz. Okay, fine. I guess we'd have to kind of, okay, yeah, it wasn't clear from the Gemara yesterday with the whole dialogue with Rabbi Akiva. I thought maybe the implication was that maybe he would agree with Rabbi Akiva that by chatas achitzon you would not be chayiv for the shirayim bachutz, but here we seem to be saying that Rabbi Nechemya would say that you are for chayiv for the shirayim bachutz. Okay. But if we're saying that it's Rabbi Nechemya that you're chayiv for the shirayim bachutz, but ema seifa, what about when the blood was received in two vessels? Kibel dama b'shnei kosis, when the blood of the korbin was received in 2 vessels, nosen shneim bifneim, if both vessels were offered in the azara, patur. Shneim bachutz chayiv, if both vessels were offered outside of the azara, chayiv. Echad bifnim ve'echad bachutz patur. And the Mishnah says if one of the vessels was applied inside of the azara, the other vessel was applied outside of the azara, chayiv. But v'amr Reb Nechem yishari adam shekrivam bachutz chayiv. But if we're saying that the Mishnah is Reb Nechemya, and Reb Nechemya says that the leftover blood you be chayiv bachutz, so why are we then saying that when you receive the blood in 2 vessels, the first vessel is applied inside of the azara? I would think that means that the second vessel is shirayim, and if we take that shirayim bachutz, you should be chayiv if we're talking about Reb Nechemya, right? So answers the Gemara. Seifa saw in the Tanakama de Belazar Brib Shimon de Amar Kos Ose Dachar the Chaver. There was a machlokes earlier in the Masechta, if you remember, friends. Hopefully, I remember. I didn't look it up. I didn't re-look it up. I think I remember based on what Rashi says. Sounds familiar. It was a long time ago. It was it was about almost 3 months ago, 2.5, 3 months ago. So there was a machlokes that if the blood was received in 4 vessels. What if the blood was received in 4 vessels, but you did all of the applications of the blood from the first vessels, so you don't need the other 3 vessels. You did all the bloody stuff you had to do. You did all that with the first vessels. So what happens to the other 3 vessels? It's a machlokes. Rabbi Shimon says that the other 3 vessels are shirayim. Rabbi Shimon says that the other 3 vessels are shirayim. So Kilu, you did all the bloody stuff you needed to from the first vessel. The remaining 3 are shirayim. What do you do with the shiari adam for a korbin chatas? You pour it on the yesod, on mizbeach achitza. So Rabbi Shimon says that the remaining vessels are shirayim. Shiari adam. The Tanakama, and we're saying that this clearly must be then Rab Nechemya, says that no, the remaining 3 vessels are pasul. The remaining 3 vessels are pasul. What was the word that we said? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't love sheep. Okay. Yeah, I guess. Okay. Does it? Okay. Yeah, I think we could just say pasul. That's what I'm going to go with. So the remaining vessels are pasul, and you don't pour them on the yesod of the mizbeach chitzon. You pour them into the amma, into the stream that runs through the azara to take everything out of the azara. So we're saying that the Tanakama. So basically, what happened? You have this korbin chatas. You received the blood in 4 vessels. You did all the bloody stuff you needed to do with the first vessel. What's the status of the remaining 3 vessels? The Tanakama says that they're all pasul. They're all nidche. You don't need them. They're pasul. You spill them out in the amma, in the stream that runs through the azar. And we're saying that that's the opinion of Reb Nechemya. And therefore, how does it apply to our Mishnah? The way it applies to our Mishnah is that you received the blood of the chatas in 2 vessels. The first vessel, you did all the applications of the dam. What's with the second vessel now? The second vessel is pasul. It's not shirayim, it's simply pasul. So if you take pasul blood and you take it out of the azar and pour it on the altar that you have over there, or do whatever you want with it in the altar that you have over there, Rabbi Nechemya is going to say they're going to be patur for that since it's in a separate vessel. Again, Seifa Asa in the Tanakama, the Rab Elazar Rab Shimon, that the Seifa, which is talking about the 2 vessels, that the blood of the chatas was received in 2 vessels, that is like the Tanakama of Rab Elazar Rab Shimon, the Amar who says, Kos Ose Dachar Lachavero, that when you have the blood of a korbin chatas that's received in 4 vessels, and you do all the bloody stuff with one of the vessels, well then it pushes off all the other 3 vessels. All the other 3 vessels are pasul, and you spill them out. And therefore, here as well, the second vessel is simply pasul, and we're saying that the Tanakama, who holds that way, is in fact Reb Nechemya. Says the Gemara, well, the Mishnah had said, Lema davar dome. What are these 2 vessels similar to? Lemafish chatosu ve'ovdo v'ifish acheres tachtel ve'achar kach nimtzeis harishona. We said, what are these 2 vessels of blood similar to? It's like when you have 2 potential korbin chatases, Sarah the U and Rivka the U. You had initially set aside Sarah got lost. You set aside Rivka, Sarah was found. You have 2 animals that can now be offered as korbin chatases. Right? So we said that's similar to the two vessels of blood. Why do we need this Lama'adav Doma? Right? Usually we do just fine when the Mishnayos quotes halacha and doesn't need to compare it to any other thing. Why the comparison here? Hamani Rebbe, what the Mishnah is saying is that it's fleshing out the sugya more, and he's saying that, well, these animals, Sarah the U, Rivka the U, are like, these are the opinion of Rebbe, the Amar, who says, Avuda b'shas hafrasha, that so long as Sarah was out of the picture, was lost, when Rivka was set aside to be the korbin chatas instead, Mesa, if Sarah is then found, and now you have two options, both you have Sarah and Rivka, that you can offer the korbin chatas from. So whichever one is offered, the other one will be left to die. This is what the Mishnah is saying. The reason why the reason why this scenario of Sarah and Rivka are similar to the two vessels of blood is because Sarah got lost. But if this was a different scenario, if the scenario was that Reuven needed to bring a korbin chatas, he says, okay, I'm going to bring a korbin chatas. He says, look, if I only set aside Sarah the U, what if something happens to Sarah the U? What if on the way to the Beis HaMikdash it gets a mum or something? Now what am I going to do? So he says, you know what? I'm going to separate. I'm going to take both Sarah and Rivka the U's, and obviously I'm only going to offer one of them, but the other one is going to be just in case something happens to Sarah the U. I'll add Rivka the U. Everything goes smoothly. Sarah the U is offered. Now what to do with Rivka the U? So Chada Minayu Meikara Ola. What happens is, in that case, Sarah the U was offered as the korbin chatas. What happens to Rivka the U in that case, when it was set aside milichatchila as achrayis, Rivka the U is left to graze until it gets a mum, and when it gets a mum, it's then sold, and its money is used to buy an ola kates amizbeach that we've learned about. So essentially, ultimately, Rivka the U is going to end up as a korbin ola. And you would be chayiv for that bachutz, of course. So if Rivka the U was then, so if we're talking about achrayis, and Sarah the U was offered, and then Rivka the U was slaughtered outside and offered outside, you would be chayiv for that, because ultimately it's a korbin ola. Uchdavuna amarav, and like Ravuna amarav, the amar Ravuna amarav, oshrim shenitok l're'iyah. Of course, we learned this recently, right? That kol shebechatos mesa ba'oshrim yireh. That these scenarios by a korbin chatas where it's left to starve to death, by a korbin osham, you would let it graze, get a mum, and then it becomes an ola. So v'shachat ostam, if you slaughter this osham that is meant to be grazing, you slaughter it. So kosher la'ola, it would be kosher as a korbin ola, because ultimately it's going to be offered as a korbin ola. Midami, wait, can you compare the two U's that were set for achrayis, for a korbin chatas, and the osham, shenita kliriyah? Hasam osham zacher v'ola zacher. An osham could default to an ola, because an osham is a male sheep, and so is a ola. Aval chatas nekevei, but chatases are U's. They're female. Well, you could say that the chatas that Rebbe is talking about, that if they were set for achrayis and the other one will be an ola, you could say that's talking about the sa'ir nasi. If the nasi is to be called chatas, he of course, right, the king, he of course brings a sa'ir nasi, and that is male, and that could be a korbin ola, and that is what Rebbe is talking about for the achrayis, that would default to an ola. Hadron Olach Hashoichid V'Amala. We will come back to you. Perek Hashoichid V'Amala. Wow, this is exciting times. We are mamish about to start summiting Mount Zevachim. Friends, now we begin the final chapter of Masechta Zevachim, and we will discuss all sorts of things you are patur for. Bachutz, says the Mishnah, Paras chatas Shesarfo, chutz migita. So paras chatas is a reference to the para aduma. So the para aduma is not slaughtered in the Beis Hamikdash to begin with. It is slaughtered on Har Mishcha, on the Mount of Olives. But that being said, there is a specific place for it to be slaughtered, and if it was not slaughtered in the right place, the question is, would that be an instance of shchutei chutz? V'chein soyer mishtaleach. Similarly, you have on Yom Kippur, you have this goat that is chucked off a cliff. It's not offered as a korbin in the Beis Hamikdash. So what if that is offered? What if instead of chucking it off the cliff, it was offered as a korbin bachutz? So would it be chayiv in these cases? So patur. In both of those cases, patur shene emar vel pesach oil moed lo yavioi, that it was not brought. Right, the issue with shchutei chutz is that they were talking about animals that were meant to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash, and they were not brought to the Beis Hamikdash. So you are chayiv for them. Kol she'ein roi lavoy el pesach oil moed, but if it wasn't fit to come to the Beis Hamikdash and be offered in the Beis Hamikdash to begin with, like the Sarah Mishtaleach, like the Para Aduma, Ein Chayav and Olav, you won't be Chayav for that. Haroveya, an animal that had Bia with a woman or a person, Vanirva, or was Bia'd by a person, V'amukta, or set aside to be Avodah Zarah, Vanevad, or was actually worshipped as Avodah Zarah, V'amechir, and an animal that was used as payment for a hunt, for a dog, va'esnon, or as payment for a harlot, va'kilayim, va'trefa, or an animal that is a mixture of other animals like a sheep and a goat or something, va'trefa, and a treif, an animal that is a treifa, v'yotze dofen, or an animal that was a C-section, she'krivan bachutz, any of these animals that were offered bachutz, patur. Shenemar l'fnei Mishkan Hashem, as it says before the tabernacle of the Lord, kol she'eid ra'ui lavo l'fnei Mishkan Hashem ein chayav and olav. If we're talking about animals that you wouldn't be offering as korbanos in the tabernacle, well then you would not be chayav for slaughtering them bachutz. Ba'alei mumin, if we're talking about an animal that is a ba'al mum, bein ba'alei mumin kvuin, bein ba'alei mumin ovrin, whether this is a permanent blemish, like it's missing a leg or something, or whether it is a blemish that is temporary and will heal itself. Patur, either way, since the animal is a mum, you will be patur if you offer it bachutz. Now here comes the opinion of Reb Shimon, who says, Reb Shimon Omer Bali Mumin Kvuin Patur, that while missing a leg, for example, a permanent blemish, you will be patur for offering bachutz. Bali Mumin Ovrin Chai below sizes. Says Reb Shimon, however, if we're talking about a blemish that will heal and just give it time, and this is an animal that can be offered as a korbin, well, in that case, says Reb Shimon, that you will be in violation of a lo taseh. It doesn't say which lo taseh. The Gemara apparently is going to let us know. We are about to see now a few scenarios like this, where an animal or even a person is temporarily unable to be in the korbin game, but will in the future become available for korbanis. And Reb Shimon says in those cases that while you're not chayiv kares for shchutei chutz, you will be in violation of a lav. Torim shelo igia zmanan uvnei yonish over zmanan. Now, when we're talking about bird offerings, we're talking about turtle doves and young doves. Now, young doves need to be offered when they are young. If they are too old, they can't be offered anymore. Turtle doves need to be offered when they are more mature, not when they are young. So now, when it comes, so again, Torim shelo igia zmanan, turtle doves that are too young, uvnei yonish over zmanan, and young doves that are too old, she'ekrivan bachutz, that were offered bachutz, patur. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon b'nei yonish over zmanan patur. Reb Shimon says, look, I agree that young doves that are too old and they're no longer young, well, you'll be patur for that. But v'torim shelo igia zmanan below taise. But turtle doves that are simply not yet mature, but will become mature, so you will be in violation of a lav. No kares, but a violation of a lav. Also v'ez beno, we are going to learn about in Masechta Chulin. There is a chapter in Masechta Chulin called Oso ve'ezbeno that talks about the prohibition of slaughtering a parent and child animal on the same day. So if, for example, you were to slaughter a mother goat on a particular day, you can't slaughter the offspring on that same day. So, but just wait a day and then you can. Additionally, an animal can only be offered as a korbin from the 8th day of its life. If it is not yet 8 days old, it can't be offered as a korbin, but just be patient and wait, and then it can, once it's 8 days old. So patur. So says the Tanna Kama, in either of these cases, you will be patur for offering these animals. Right, since you can't offer oso v'esmeno or mechusar zman. Reb Shimon Omer, says Reb Shimon, well, just be patient. You can just wait until it is, wait till the next day for oso v'esmeno, or wait until 8 days for mechusar zman, and then it is permitted. Although we're going to see that mechusar zman, it could also refer to people as well. We're going to see in a second. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon kolshu ra'ui lavu la'achar zman arei below saise vein bokar. Says Reb Shimon, because Reb Shimon's general theme is, as we've seen over the past few scenarios, that if something is presently unable to be offered as a korbin, but will become available in the future, so while you won't be chayiv karis, you will be over on a lab. Say the chacham, kol she'ein bo karis, ein bo lo sais. Say the chacham, look, if there's no chiyuv karis, well then there's no negative commandment, there's no prohibition. Mechusar zman, when we are talking about mechusar zman, bein begufa bein bebaylev, mechusar zman, lacking enough time, that could refer either to the animal itself, it's not yet 8 days old, but it can also refer to the owner of the animal. For example, ezu mechusar zman bebaylev, what would be examples of lacking time for the owners? Hazav ve'azava, for example, a zav, person who saw stuff that he shouldn't be seeing coming out of his you-know-what. So he becomes a zav. He's got to wait a week and don't see any of that stuff. Ve'azava is a woman who's seeing dam nida when she shouldn't be seeing dam nida. She also needs to wait a week without seeing any ziva. Vayoledes, a yoledes who has to wait 40 days for a boy, 80 days for a girl. V'amitzora, and somebody who has saras, right? These are all people that over, if they pass a certain amount of time and they are without having saras or without having ziva, whatever it is, yoledes just takes 40 or 80 days. She'akrivu, that they offered chatas and ba'ashamim bachutz paturin. If they offer their chatas or asham, so an asham I think would only be that by the mitzora. There's no ashram by a yoledes or a zav and a zava, but they do all bring chatases. So if those chatases or ashrams were offered bachutz paturin, they would be paturin in those cases, because chatases and ashrams can't be offered bachutz. But if they offer their olas and shlomim, so they would all bring olas. I don't think any of them would actually bring shlomims. And so the question is, why are we talking about shlomims here? I think the Gemara is going to talk about that. But if they are offered bachutz, you would be chayiv, because they could bring, they could offer shlomims and olas and stuff, right? Their chatas and their ashrams are premature, but they can offer olas nedava, shalmi nedava. Hamayle mi besar chatos. Somebody is mayle the meat of a korbin chatas bachutz. Mi besar asham, or the meat of a korbin asham. Mi besar kodshe kodshim, or the meat of kodshe kodshim. We're not talking about chatas or asham, because we already mentioned chatas asham. We're not talking about ola, because there's no meat of the ola. That's all the limbs that is burnt, right? You don't get the meat of an ola. Rather, it's talking about the shalmei tzibur, which are the kivsei atzeres, the sheep offered on Shavuos. Mi besar kodshim kalim, or the meat of kodshim kalim. Umosera omer, or the korbin omer that is offered on the 16th of Nisan. One, you would burn a kometz on the mizbeach, and the rest was the shiare hamincha. Vishtei alechem v'lechem aponim. Or if the Shtei alechem on Shavuos, or the 12 showbreads every week were burnt on an outer altar. V'shiarei menachos, leftovers of mincha after the kometz has been burnt. V'ayotzek, if somebody were to pour oil on a mincha, v'aposes, or to break up a mincha that has been baked in the oven. V'abolel, or somebody who mixes the oil and the flour together. V'amoleach, and somebody who salts a korbin. V'amenif, or somebody who does tenufa on a korbin. V'amagish, v'amasader, and brings it to the mizbeach and orders. V'amasader sashulchan, somebody were to organize the breads on the shulchan. V'ametiv v'saneros, or to clean up the, prepare the candles, which the shulchan and the menorah are generally in the heichal, but I guess you maybe took it out of the heichal or something. The kometz, somebody takes a kometz from a mincha v'makabel dam bachutz, and somebody does kabbalah sadam, all of these things bachutz, patur. You would be patur in these scenarios. Now, what is the Gozbach changes to? Ve'ein bohem, and none of these things have lo mishum zarus. Right? In any of these examples, if a zar did these melachas, while the melacha will be pasul, while the avoda would be pasul, there would be no chiyuv kares, or there would not be a chiyuv misa for doing it as a zar. V'lo mishum tuma, nor if you did these avodah, there would be no chiyuv misa for tuma if you do these avodas either. Whereas I should say because Tuma and Zarus are learned out in the same place. So if you're not going to be chayiv misa for being a Zar, you're not going to be chayiv misa for being Tami. Nor if a kohen would do these avodas without proper garb, because a kohen who doesn't have proper garb is basically a Zar. And we already said a Zar is not chayiv misa. And also there won't be right, and also you won't be chayiv misa without doing Richos Yadayim V'Raglayim, because that is learned out from Mechusar Begadim. Okay, so you won't be chai for any of those things for these melachos. Now the Mishnah gives us a bit of a history lesson about Bamahs. When were they allowed? When were they not allowed? What were the implications of them being allowed? Ad Sheloi Hukam HaMishkan, that prior to the establishment of the tabernacle in the desert, bamas mutaris, people prior to the tabernacle, people could make their own private altars and offer korbanos on them. V'avoda bebechoros, additionally, until that point, any avoda that needed to be done, imagine there probably wasn't too much of it at that point, but any avoda that needed to be done was handled by the firstborns. Umishukam HaMishkan, once the tabernacle was erected, ne'esru bamas. Bamas were no longer allowed in the desert. Private altars were no longer allowed in the desert. All korbanos had to be brought to the Mishkan. Va'avoda b'kohanim, and from that point on, the priests did the service in the tabernacle. Kodshe kodshim nechon lifnim naklayim. Kodshe kodshim would be eaten within the confines of the tabernacle. The kodshim kalim b'chol machne Yisrael, and kodshim kalim could be eaten anywhere within the encampments of Israel, right? Of course, when there's the Beis HaMikdash, Kodshim Kalim could be in anywhere in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is basically Machne Yisrael, the equivalent of Machne Yisrael. Machne Yisrael being all of where the Yidden were encamped. Kodshim Kalim could be eaten there. Bo'la Gilgal, when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua, they first went to Gilgal, and there the Mishkan stood for 14 years. And during that period, Hutru Bamas, you could make, during that period, a bama in your backyard. Kodshe kodshim nechalin lifnim min akloim. Any kodshe kodshim that were offered at the Mishkan in Gilgal would be eaten within the confines of the Mishkan. The kodshim kalim b'chol makom. And where would you eat kodshim kalim? Because the Yidden weren't encamped in the same way that they were in the desert. So wherever the Yidden were, they can eat kodshim kalim. As Rashi points out, that they didn't say anything about Meiser Sheni, where Meiser Sheni can be eaten, because Meiser Sheni was only separated after the conquest and the settling of the land. During Gilgal, they were still in conquest and settling mode. Bo Shiloh, after Gilgal, the Mishkan was in Shiloh, Ne'esu Habamas, and while the Mishkan was in Shiloh, backyard bamas were not allowed. Sham tikra in Shiloh, there was no roof, there was no like wooden roof. Rather, ela base avonim bilvad milmatan. There was, I think the point is, there was a foundation of stone below the Mishkan in Shiloh. V'rios milamala, and there were just the curtains above. The roof was the or elim adamim was tchoshim in the izim, the oil izim. There was the curtains that they had in the desert for the Mishkan is what they had for the Mishkan Shiloh. V'hi aisa menucha, and when the pasuk says kilovosim ato ela menucha ve'lanachla, so menucha is a reference to Shiloh. Kodshe kodshim necholin lifnim min aklayim. Kodshe kodshim were eaten within the confines of Mishkan Shiloh. V'kodshim kalim u'maiser sheni, and then kodshim kalim as well as anybody who brought maiser sheni b'chol haroeh. Very interesting to think that at that point you would bring your maiser sheni to Shiloh. That's interesting. Of course, we know that maiser sheni is brought to Yerushalayim, but when the Mishkan was in Shiloh, you would separate maiser sheni, you'd bring it to Shiloh. Wow. What would happen in the Shalosh Regalim? Did you go to Shiloh for the Shalosh Regalim? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the Gemara will talk about it. I assume not. But it says the maiser sheni was brought to Shiloh. That's interesting. Bo Lenov, after Shiloh, after with Eli and things got messy in Shiloh, so then Bo Lenov, the tabernacle was brought to Nov. After Nov was destroyed, the tabernacle was brought to Givon. So Bo Lenov v'Givon hutru Bamahs. Bamas were then permitted once again while the tabernacle was in Nov and Givon. Now, if you brought kachim that were brought in the tabernacle, whether in Nov, whether in Givon, they were eaten within the confines of the tabernacle. Kachim kalim b'chol ari, and also the goes Vitzunim adds also maiser sheni b'chol ari Yisrael once again could be eaten anywhere in Israel. Kachim kalim and maiser sheni could be eaten anywhere in Israel. Boli Yerushalayim. Then when there was the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, nesra bamas v'lo haya lohen heter. And then once there was the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, there was no Bamahs were no longer ever permitted. That was the end of Bamahs. V'hi aisa nachla. And that was the nachla. When the pasuk says "Kilovasim ad ata la menucha vela nachla," the Beis Hamikdash is the nachla. Kodshe kodshim nechol lefnim naklayim. Kodshe kodshim were eaten within the azara. Kodshim kalim u'maiser sheni lefnim min achoma, and kodshim kalim and maiser sheni were eaten. I assume that the choma here is a reference to the choma to the walls of Jerusalem. Let me just double check that, unless there's some kind of interesting chiddush here that I missed. Let's see. Yeah, the walls surrounding Jerusalem. Yeah. So then, of course, as we know, kachim kalim and maiser sheni would be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem. Kol akachim sheikdeshin b'shas isra bamas, they krivon b'shas isra bamas. Okay, any kachim that was designated as a korbin while bamas were forbidden and offered while bamas were forbidden. That's basically what we've been discussing for the past week or so. So they were offered bachutz during this time. Okay, chayiv karis. You're also in violation of mitzvahs essay of the vium laHashem, that they need to be brought for Hashem, and also the losaise, which I think the point is the losaise that we saw by hamayla bachutz, which we then also applied to hashaychid bachutz. Unless we're talking about Kilu being chayiv for all of it, shochet and mailim. Anyways, but you chayiv karis. Hekdeshon b'shas heter bamas. If it was designated when bamas were permitted, ve'krivim b'shas isra bamas, but then they were offered when the bamas were forbidden, bachutz outside of the azar. Hare elu be'esev losaiz ve'ein chayavin alein karis. This was the first daf of perek, the previous perek. Hashochet v'amayla, where we discussed that if they were designated when Bamahs were allowed, but then Bamahs became not allowed. So you will not be chayiv kares, but you will be in violation of mitzvahs esei and mitzvahs lo saisei. Hekdesham b'shas isra bamas ve'krivim b'shas heter bamas. If they were designated when Bamahs were osur, but then Bamahs became permitted, hare elu be'esei ve'en b'en lo saisei. So they were designated when Bamahs were forbidden. So then immediately when you designated them, you had the mitzvahs esei of, okay, well now that you designated it, you have to bring it to Yerushalayim. But then Bamahs became permitted, then you no longer, so if you offer it outside of the Azara, when Bamahs are permitted, so you won't be in, chayiv for anything, but there will still be that mitzvahs esei that was already applicable from the time that you slaughtered it to bring it to Yerushalayim, and you didn't do that. Ve'elu kachim kravin b'mishkan. These kachim were offered in the Mishkan. Kachim she'ukdishu la-Mishkan. Kachim that were designated, set aside, makdished for the Mishkan. Korbanos tzibur kravin b'Mishkan. Communal offerings would be offered in the Mishkan, not on private Bamahs, but in communal offerings in the Mishkan. The korbanos hayachid b'Bama. But individual korbanos, generally speaking, can be offered on Bamahs. Korbanos hayachid Shehukdishu la Mishkan. Now, if somebody designated, let's say, korbin shlom, but said, I'm going to bring it to the Mishkan, yakivu b'Mishkan, well then it should be brought to the Mishkan, v'im ekrivim b'Bama patur. But if he didn't do that, if he offered it on a Bama, after saying that he was going to bring it to the Mishkan, he is nonetheless patur. Ma ben Bamas yachid Bamas tzibur. What's the difference between a private altar and the altar in the Mishkan? Smicha v'shchitas tzofin. On a private altar, there's no leaning on the animal. You don't have to slaughter an ola in the tzafon in the north, for example. Matan saviv, you don't need to do shtaim shein arba utnufa ve'agasha. You don't need to. Rashi says dafka wave korbin minchas and then bring them to the mizbeach. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein mincha be bama. Rabbi Yehuda says there are no menachos when it comes to bamas. V'kiyun. You don't need kohanim on Bamahs in your own private backyard. You don't need to bring in a kohen to do anything. You can do it yourself, even if you're not a kohen. Uvigdei sharis, you don't need the big day kahuna or anything like that. Viklei sharis, or special vessels and equipment. V'reach nichayach, there was a requirement that we have learned in the past by korbanos that it needs to be a reach nichayach that has to smell good. So if you have limbs of the animal that were already cooked and they don't have a particular, their great smell was already depleted when you already cooked it. So normally by a regular korbin, you wouldn't want to burn that because it's not going to have the great smell. That isn't relevant by a bama. Mechitza lidamim. There's no need for a chatas sikra. V'richutz yadayim v'raglayim. You don't have to wash your hands and feet before offering it. Aval azman anoser v'tameh. But pigul, noser, and tameh would apply to your own private altar. V'shavim bazel vazeh they are relevant also to bamas, right? So if you offer a shlomim on a bama, for example, you have 2 days to eat it. Don't eat it after 3 days, right? Don't eat it when you're tameh. Don't slaughter with machshavas chutz zman or chutz komo. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Yud Beis of Masechta Zevachim. On Daf Kuf Yud Beis of Masechta Zevachim, of course, we really started on Daf Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. We started by discussing the Mishnah that we had learned yesterday about offering bird offerings bachutz and the intricacies mainly of Reb Shimon's opinion, which is a little bit tricky for us to run through because there was a lot of inside and outside. But anyways, essentially Reb Shimon says where we landed was that melika done in the azara, if you take the bird outside of the azara and burn it, you'll be chayev. And also says Reb Shimon, if you do melika even outside of the azara and burn it outside, according to Reb Shimon, you will be chayev, just like you would be chayev for doing it if you did melika in the azara. We discussed the blood of a korbin, chatas, bachutz, all sorts of scenarios. If it was received in one vessel, if it was received in 2 vessels. We saw the opinion of Reb Nechemya about the shirayim being poured on the mizbeach achitzon, and that would really only, if you take the shirayim and pour it on the bachutz, you will be, they should be on the mizbeach achitzon, but you did bachutz, you will be chayev. We saw the opinion that Reb Nechemia says that if you're talking about 2 vessels though, and the avodah was done with 1 vessel, the other vessel becomes pasul, and you would be patur if you applied it or poured it bachutz. We then also talked about chatos amesos a little bit. Fine. Sarah and Rivka, the ooze. We then began the final parak of Masechta Zevachim, and we learned about all sorts of things that you would be patur for bachutz. I'm not going into all of them. And we had a very interesting history lesson about when were bamas allowed, when weren't they allowed, what were able to be offered on bamas, what couldn't be offered on bamas. Very interesting stuff. Chevra, I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. I'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers.